Could you build a business that's better for our planet? That's what I have set out to answer. Hi, I'm Marco Pimentel, marketing expert and entrepreneur, and host of the podcast Someone Like You. I become fascinated in finding creative climate solutions in business, and on the podcast, I break down how founders and CEOs are building climate-friendly business solutions that are opportunities for growth while being better for the planet.
One thing about working on environmental issues, whether it's forestry or now climate change, is you always really feel like you're running in front of the bulldozer. There's always, that if you don't get this legislation soon, more trees will fall or more carbon will be released and trapped into the atmosphere. So there's always this sense of urgency and scale.
In 1993, 870 people were arrested for civil disobedience in the Clayoquot protest, a series of blockades related to clearcutting in Clayoquot Sound, British Columbia. Today's guest, Tzeporah Berman, was one of the main spokespersons and blockade coordinators at the time. Today, she is the International Program Director and co-founder of Stand.earth, a grassroots environmental organization and chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Proposed treaty to explicitly stop the expansion of fossil fuel exploitation and manage a just transition away from coal, oil, and gas to clean energy. Originally studying arts, fashion, and design, Tzeporah promptly switched to studying environmental studies at the University of Toronto after backpacking through Europe in the late 1980s and saw firsthand the impact industrialization had on the Harz mountains in Germany. I speak with Tzeporah on how she found herself in jail right after university supporting the Clayoquot protests, from what she learned thereafter that change is made through power. She also shares that we've built more investments in clean renewable energy in the last year, but still need to continue declining emissions and productions to combat climate change. The world is being really reinvented, from how we heat our homes to how we travel, and Tzeporah's work through Stand.earth and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative shows us that now is an exciting and essential time to get involved and stand up for our Earth. I wanted to take a second to tell you about our Season 2 sponsor, Digital Scope. Did you know your website has a carbon footprint? Well, digital technology has a larger carbon footprint than the entire aviation industry, and it's only getting bigger. Digital power consumption is increasing by 9% every year. At this rate, our digital carbon footprint could be responsible for as much as 14% of global emissions by 2040. If you're a digital-first company, or really any company with a website, and want to understand the impact your website is having on the environment, Digital Scope can translate visitor data into carbon measurement, all with a simple one line of code added to your website. Check out digitalscope.com/someonelikeyu. The first 100 people to sign up get free access for an entire year. Tzeporah, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you have an incredible background, a long history in forestry, trying to protect our forests, working to bring light what's happening, obviously, with fossil fuels. But before we talk about all of the awards, the TED Talk, the efforts that you have put into really dedicating your life to bring awareness, I wanted to just understand earlier, like where did you start? Was it, you started at school, university? Did you love the outdoors? And you're like, just to understand where you started with your journey to understand that our Earth needs to be protected, and this is where I want to dedicate my life to.
Well, I guess it was about 30 years ago, a little more than that. I actually started in university in fashion arts design. And I think it was, because I loved art, I loved art history, and I knew though I also needed a trade. I needed to figure out what my job was going to be. And I applied to fashion arts design school and I got in and I did my first year and I did pretty well. And, and I remember feeling though, just kind of feeling empty. And I think it was at the beginning for me at that young age of whatever that was, 21 or 22, I was starting to have an environmental conscience and thinking about those issues. And I just didn't love the fashion industry, and I felt like I was kind of skirting some of the big issues of my time. So I was having a little bit of a personal crisis, I guess, and I decided to go traveling that summer, and when I backpacked through Europe, and I had this really bizarre experience. I went to Athens. I was going to go and climb the Acropolis, and I always wanted to see it. And back then, like when was that? I don't know, 89, 90. The air pollution in Europe was terrible. It was before a lot of the laws that are in place now that kind of reduced air pollution. And I can remember really vividly being at the Acropolis, and it was before it was restored. So, it's crumbling as a result of the pollution and dirty. And I was looking down on the city, and it was just this yellow haze. And I got back to my hostel that night, and I was kind of coughing up black stuff. And I just, and, and I remember I was with my sister. I remember turning to my sister saying, I have to be in nature. Let's go pick somewhere where we can go hiking. So we randomly picked the Harz Mountains in Germany, and we were all joking around about hiking and Lederhosen, and we're going to have beer. And we went and took a train. And what we didn't know is that that area of the Harz Mountains is completely dead and has been left standing as a testimony to the impact of industrial civilization, acid rain. So I spent the day hiking through these standing, dead, creepy forests. No leaves, no birds, no anything. And the combination of those two experiences, the really polluted city, the standing dead forest, it was a real wake-up call for me. I was from Canada. I kind of and I went back and I dropped out of fashion arts design, and I applied to the University of Toronto to do a degree in environmental studies. And that was really the beginning of the journey for me. I found that once I started thinking about environmental issues and our impact in the world, it was like a lens in front of my eyes, and I couldn't stop thinking about it.
And it's often the case that people have these kind of moments of connection to where they get this awe-awakening feeling of what nature looks like, and that kind of that connection. So you went to university, you did environmental studies. After you finished in Toronto, what was that next step out of university? Was it starting to work for a firm? And obviously thinking about this is 25 or 30 years ago too. And so obviously we knew what was happening to our climate back then, but obviously very different than today. What was that kind of next step?
Well, the next step was I went to jail, and that was unexpected. Um, I, I moved. I fell in love with Canada's forests, and I backpacked for a couple of years in the summers while I was at university through British Columbia because of seeing an image of the temperate rainforest in a geography class, and there were these 300-foot tall trees, 1,000 years old, and I can remember thinking I knew Brazil had rainforests, but wait, Canada, we have our own rainforests. And I went out to British Columbia and I backpacked around and started volunteering with a couple environmental groups, and I just fell in love with the temperate rainforests. And in 1992, the government made a decision, the Clayoquot land use decision, to allow the majority of one of the biggest areas of old growth rainforest that was left on Vancouver Island, Clayoquot Sound, the majority of it to be logged. And I decided to go out to Clayoquot Sound, rent a little cabin, and write my master's thesis. And maybe I could volunteer a bit and help with the local group, the Friends of Clayoquot Sound. I found them really inspiring. These were doctors and nurses and teachers and local community who were standing up and who had participated in the land use decisions and all these processes for years, and they were frustrated, and they were standing in front of the bulldozers. Now, I'd never done civil disobedience or anything in my life. I'm a good Jewish girl from Toronto. I'd never even thought about protesting. And so the first year I did what a good Jewish girl does. I cooked for them. I remember being on the blockades and kind of hiding from all the real serious stuff and just kind of cooking and trying to support all these really courageous people that I was really inspired by. And and then the following year, when I came back to write my thesis, a lot of those people had been arrested and they had gone to jail. My friends, doctors and nurses and teachers, and part of their jail requirement was they couldn't go back to the area. And so, I went back, and by this point I'd, had a year's experience, and I was doing research on the issues, and someone one day said to me, handed me a bullhorn and said, there's no one else to talk to the people who are arriving to the blockade. You talk. And I remember climbing up on top of this van with this bullhorn thinking, what the heck am I going to say? And so I just spoke from my heart, and I spoke about the research I'd been doing, and the scarcity of old growth forests worldwide, and how important these forests were for maintaining our water and our air and our and species, and and I and the crowd responded, and I don't know, I guess I haven't stopped talking since. But anyways, to make a long story short, at the end of that summer, 857 people had been arrested. It was 1993, one of the largest civil disobedience in Canada's history. And as one of the main
Yeah.
spokespeople and as one of the blockade coordinators, I was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting 857 criminal offenses and thrown in jail. I faced 6 years in jail at the time. I was 23, and eventually a bunch of really famous and amazing Canadian lawyers decided to represent me, thank goodness, for free. And we fought the charges and won. But by that time, I was a bit of a household name at that time, and I got approached by a number of different organizations, including Greenpeace, and they offered me a job as a campaigner. I at the time didn't really even quite understand what campaigning was, and that was the beginning of my journey, trying to understand how do you make social change, and how do you influence governments and corporations to do the right thing. I think at the time I thought we just have to get more people to say it, and we have to say it louder. But the Clayoquot blockades were a wake up call for me. We had 1,000 people arrested. We were front page news. We had the science on our side. We had the
Mm.
data on our side, and nothing changed. The blockades ended and the logging just continued. And that was really, for me, the beginning of my journey of trying to understand how change is made and how you build power and influence in order to create change.
Yeah, and part of that group, my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, but that was a lot of the land near the Tofino and Ucluelet area, where I think over 1 million people visit a year. I believe that ended up being saved because of some of the work that was done as well.
That's right. And
Yeah.
the majority of the intact rainforest on the whole coast of Canada, the second campaign took a part in was a campaign to protect the Great Bear Rainforest, and through a combination of tactics, the working with scientists, working with Indigenous communities, developing solutions proposals, but most importantly, building power, either through blockading and media awareness or through boycotting and getting companies to cancel their contracts, to say, look, we don't want to make our phone books and our catalogs and our out of old growth forests. We need to know that Canada, you're providing forestry products that are come from second growth forests or from selective logging. And so we really we created the first boycott and markets campaigns on forest products. And during that period, I created my first NGO, co-founded an NGO called Forest Ethics, and the goal of forest ethics was to protect forests and change forestry practices by harnessing the power of the marketplace to demand the kind of products that they wanted. And forest ethics eventually became Stand.earth, which is where I work now, and we've expanded our work from forestry and the trade of wood and paper products and protecting old growth forests to now also working on climate change.
And when people think about, and obviously a lot of people here listening are across North America, but I live in the same area as you do, and when we talk about these trees, we're talking about absolutely massive trees, obviously typically in very sensitive areas. They think river valleys and along the coast, and we have a lot of trees in BC that are if you're going to log something, there are trees here to log, and you have these massive old growth trees that it's just mind blowing that why would we ever want to cut these down? So that it sets kind of a stage. And so, how did you begin forest ethics? Like, what was that? Obviously, you by being there, by going to jail, you got some PR that people were realizing like who you were and what you were trying to stand up for. But how do you go from doing some work and campaigning for Greenpeace to I'm going to start this NGO, Forest Ethics? Here we go. Like, what was that? How did you get it started?
Well, initially, reached out to other environmental organizations that had reach. They and um, tried to convince them to engage with us on this idea of a market or boycott campaign. And so that was literally sitting in the Friends of Clayoquot Sound office in Tofino and calling up groups like Natural Resources Defense Council and Sierra Club and Rainforest Action Network, and we created a coalition. And the coalition started collaborating and working together to see if this new strategy could work. Fast forward about a couple of years, and it was working, but it was working so well that it needed its own staff. And so eventually that coalition became Forest Ethics. We made a decision to do a standalone organization. By this time, we had some successes under our belt, big contracts that had been canceled from companies like Home Depot and others, and those companies putting in place really good procurement policies that said, look, we don't want old growth, and that forced change on the ground, where the government of BC had to protect more in order to maintain their customer base, and so we we had the attention of philanthropic foundations, some of whom started funding our work, and we just kind of transformed the coalition into a standalone organization. Got our 501c3 status and a charitable status, and started hiring staff. I learned a lot about organizational development, and and I was lucky to find some really great partners right away. A guy named Todd Palia, who's now the executive director of Stand.earth, who shared my goal of creating an organization that was entrepreneurial, that would try things, and if it didn't work, try different things, that would take risks. The one thing about working on environmental issues, whether it's forestry or now climate change, is you always really feel like you're running in front of the bulldozer. There's always, that if you don't get this legislation soon, more trees will fall or more carbon will be released and trapped into the atmosphere. So there's always this sense of urgency and scale. And so, we studied organizational development. We took some workshops. Luckily had a lot of good luck along the way of meeting some great mentors who trained us. I did some training at Harvard, or the Harvard Negotiation Project under Bill Urey on negotiations. We did a lot of leadership training, and founded Forest Ethics. And it's Stand.earth. We operate global campaigns now on climate change, targeting the fashion industry, the shipping industry, to decarbonize faster, as well as local place-based campaigns on old growth or fracking. And we have 60 staff. We're a virtual organization, and at this point, we're over 20 years old, and I still feel like we still have that scrappy entrepreneurial energy, which is something I'm really proud of.
And it's all on the basis of how do you campaign to do that connection between procurement and business, or is it a combination of that as well as building audience? Like, what were the important pieces to be able to get that traction? Obviously, you need funding, and it sounds like a lot of it came from philanthropy, from other organizations to help do this type of work. But when you started building this up, like, to me, it always seems like you need to build this audience. You need people to listen. You need people to open up their checkbooks and help with these messaging. But it also sounds like you were able to get to the Home Depots of the world and those ones to impact change, to bring awareness. Like, was that a bit of the kind of the secret sauce in order to be able to kind of grow and scale that?
Yeah, it really was. A lot of people have said to us over the years that the impact that we're having is certainly outsized, given the number of people we are and how small and kind of fast moving and flexible an organization it is. I'm really proud of that. We actually just won an award this year with Fast Company listed us as one of the most entrepreneurial NGOs, and effective NGOs for our campaign on cities called Safe Cities. And that here's what I think that the secret sauce is really. It's that we have always focused our work around power. It's about building power. It's about creating power, because the incumbents, the industries, the big companies, whether they're oil and gas companies or logging companies, they have power, they have money, they have influence. And the scientists, the NGOs, the watchdogs, not so much. You have to build the power. And, after 30 years of doing this work, I think what I've come to learn is that the power comes from money or it comes from votes. You're either aggregating and creating a big tent so you can show that it's not one person that cares, it's 100,000 people that care. And that influences corporate and government decision makers, because you either, um, they have to listen to you because they know you represent enough consumers, you represent enough brand damage, or you represent enough votes. And so we started our work on the basis of the idea that knowledge is power, that for every campaign or issue we start working on, we look at um, how can we understand why, who the customers are, who's financing it, how can we follow the trail of research in the supply chain in order to understand how to influence that 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 trail. So let me give you an example. Right now, we're one of the campaigns that we're running is to decarbonize the fashion industry. So we will look at major fashion brands and then put the research group, Stand Research Group, on understanding where they get their fabric from, where it's made, what their full carbon footprint is, etc., and then rank them according to good scientific criteria. So then you have the data. You also have the kind of race to the top with a peer ranking. And then you can also tell the public exactly what's happening. And that's, threatening to a company. They all now, especially, it wasn't true 30 years ago, but now they all want to appear green. Or with our Amazon campaign, we traced the money. Who is actually financing new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon that's destroying the Amazon? Bet they don't want their shareholders to know they're doing that. And when we traced the money through Stand Research Group, we found that there were a number of European banks who have policies, climate policies, indigenous rights policies, biodiversity policies, yet they were financing oil trade in the heart of the Amazon. When we exposed it with a report a couple of years ago, 5 of them moved their money out of the Amazon. One of them, BNP Paribas, moved all oil trade out of the Amazon. It was a decision worth somewhere between $6 to $8 billion. And when that happens, the government takes notice, and people take notice of the solutions that you're trying to propose.
And when you did this years and years ago, was it difficult to get, because you're obviously creating public awareness and awareness to these companies, and they don't want to, especially when they're saying we're going to do this and then really actually they're doing that. Has it been easier in terms of the media, the PR companies, to be able to put that message out? And has it been more effective as of recent versus, let's say 10 years ago?
It's a good question, and I guess the answer is yes and no. I mean, the research is easier now. Like back then, I mean, I'm old enough to have started my first campaign when we didn't have internet. We were literally following trucks, logging trucks to the mills, and then taking mill tours. Really, you make what products? Who buys them? And looking up ship manifests in the library, trying to figure out where each ship was going, those kinds of things. Today it's all at our fingertips. We have an incredibly sophisticated research group that can track money or supply chains in seconds. We have satellite mapping tools that can, assess exactly where the logging is happening, exactly how big trees are, etc. So it's that part is easier. What's harder, I would say there are 2 big things and it's easier to reach a lot of people. So it's much easier now to put out information, to build those lists and engage those people. We can get 10,000 letters sent to a decision maker, in a matter of hours. And however, there's more noise in the system. People are hearing about different environmental issues every day. There's, the media space is so crowded. There's less reporters. There's more algorithms on Facebook and Twitter, which don't ensure that the right people will see your stuff. So that it's the media environment's super complicated and noisy. And I would say the other hard thing is, in some ways, 20 years ago, it was easier. You had good guys and you had bad guys, and they were deniers. They were, ignoring the issues. And now you have everyone saying they're green. Everyone's a climate leader. Everyone's protecting biodiversity. So you really have to do a lot of research and scrape away those big generic statements, zero carbon and zero, net zero policies, etc. It's harder to separate the wheat from the chaff and really show people what's happening. And the battle lines in some ways are less clear because everyone's pretending to be an environmentalist now.
Every week on Someone Like You, we dive into stimulating conversations with founders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and the likes who are consciously and successfully creating sustainable business solutions for the long haul. Tune in every week for a new inspiring conversation on leading climate solutions. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and a review. Yeah, and I remember Stand.earth, I think, was involved in one of the campaigns to talk about the banking industry, and it was funny because, not funny, but I was talking to somebody that connected me to somebody at Royal, the RBC in Canada, and at the time I was talking to this person. The statement came out, and I think it might have been Stand.earth that did it. And this campaign that RBC is one of the dirtiest banks in terms of funding fossil fuels. While I'm having this conversation, and I was like, oh, and I shared that with them. I said, this has come out, and it is incredibly powerful. But then, as you said, Chevron, for instance, will say that we're going to be, net zero by 2050, but that's only for what they say is, their scope 1, which is probably about 5 to 10% of their actual emissions, and they're ignoring the other 90%. But just to a normal consumer, that doesn't they won't be able to make that distinction, which is the hard part. And so, thinking outside of Stand.earth and obviously working on climate change there, which I'm sure probably led you into the fossil fuel industry and talking about that. And I can't ignore to ask you questions about this because we have you on the show. You had an incredible TED Talk at at Countdown to discuss really the fossil fuel industry and how governments are largely ignoring it and continuing to fund it. And I wanted to just ask about how you kind of took that and the understanding that you have over the years when it comes to fossil fuels. And I just recently read a book by Vaclav Smil around how the world really works. And, it's this daunting task of how do we switch from fossil fuels. And so a lot of people have a lot of questions around it. And so how did you come up with the idea to create the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and how does it work?
Well, thank you. It was quite an experience doing that TED Talk. I tried to summarize 10 years of research and work into 10 minutes. I'm glad you appreciated it. That was quite a journey. Look, when I realized what was happening on climate change, and I had what I talk in my first book about, my climate reckoning moment. Here I was, kind of on top of my game. Created forest ethics. We're forcing big corporations to move. We're protecting forests. Then these maps come across my desk showing that the majority, like huge swaths, millions of hectares of forests are either burning up because of climate change or being destroyed by beetle infestation. And I had this, an existential moment. I thought, I've spent my entire adult life trying to protect these forests from runaway logging and clearcut logging, and now they're just going up in flames. And it was really through my love of forests and my work that I started realizing what was happening on climate change. Everyone has their climate moment. For some people, it's the fires, the floods that they literally are having to escape, or it's a family member, or it's, for me, it was the impact on forests. So I started doing my research and realized that, when you look at the data, it's very clear that the majority of the pollution that's trapped in our atmosphere that's causing a sweltering blanket on the earth, causing the fires, the floods, climate change, comes from three things: oil, gas, and coal. And it's actually 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere come from oil, gas, and coal. And so that led me to, okay, well, what are the solutions? How do we reduce our dependency on oil, gas, and coal? Who's doing what? And I was pretty horrified to find out that Canada had a terrible track record on climate change. That I didn't even realize it. That we were, emissions continue to go up. That we had at the time one of the worst records of all G20 countries. And when I started looking into why, it was because of the expansion of fracking and tar sands, and still is. And that's 20 years later. I'm working on climate change now for almost 20 years, and so what I realized, in that long process of 20 years, was that no country or company wants to constrain how much fossil fuels they produce, because they think, well, someone's going to produce it. It's like a big tragedy of the commons. We have a right to be competitive, and while countries are producing targets and emissions and pollution reduction targets, they're just continuing to build out more and more and more fossil fuels. And in fact, we're on track right now to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal than the world can ever burn, or they will burn us. So we're continuing to produce a product and spending a lot of financial and political, intellectual capital to produce these products that we already have enough of, in fact, on the surface of the planet. And so I realized this was not a national issue. Of course, we need national regulations, but it's an international issue. So I kind of turned my attention to the Paris Agreement. What are we doing? What are the international agreements? Well, all the international agreements are on emissions. They're on emissions and targets, and there aren't yet systems in place. The Paris Agreement is a great agreement, but there needs to be companion international agreements on who gets to produce what fossil fuels and how much. How do we wind them down? Because what I also found out is we have the technology today to replace almost all of our fossil fuel use. Not all of it, but the majority of it. And with electrification, with renewable energy, with energy efficiency, it's heat pumps instead of gas in your houses, it's induction stoves instead of gas stoves, it's etc. And electric cars, electric infrastructure, public transportation. But we're not doing it. We're not doing it fast enough to keep us safe. And that's because of the power of the fossil fuel industry. So I spent a couple of years studying nuclear non-proliferation and landmines and chemical weapons bans, and really kind of looked throughout history of when we have these intransigent issues that can't be solved by one country, how does it work? How long does a treaty take? What could it look like? And what I realized is that, the journey matters. Just proposing that countries stop expanding the problem, and that we collaborate to create rules for how to wind down fossil fuels. Who gets to produce how much oil, and not just leave it up to the marketplace or OPEC. Just proposing that is starting to create new bilateral and multilateral negotiations. It's starting to shift the social norm around fossil fuels, because look, let's be clear, we've all grown up with fossil fuels as being a benefit to us. As I remember those stories. What was that show, the Beverly Hillbillies, where there was they hit oil and it's a geyser,
Yep.
and everybody parties,
Yeah.
and so in our minds, fossil fuels are something that are linked to prosperity, just like nuclear weapons were linked to security. But now fossil fuels are literally what's killing us. Actually, just air pollution from fossil fuels kills more people globally every year than anything else. They're poisoning our bodies, they're poisoning our air, they're poisoning our water, and they're destroying our climate. And we now know that. So now, today, fossil fuels are what threaten us. They are our weapons of mass destruction. Well, with nuclear non-proliferation, through that campaign and that treaty work, nuclear weapons went from being something that provides security to a recognition that stockpiling nuclear weapons is what's threatening us. And that's what we have to do with fossil fuels. We have to shift the social norm. We have to decrease the social license of fossil fuel companies so our governments will stop subsidizing them, will stop approving new projects, and start to collaborate on new rules to wind it down. So working with a number of academics who had written a paper on this idea of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, I created a steering committee, and at first everybody thought we were crazy. Then I won the Climate Breakthrough Award, which is an amazing award given to a couple of leaders globally a year. They give you $2 to $3 million and say, try and find a breakthrough climate solution. No pressure. And and so I launched the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and just started hiring a dream team of lawyers and diplomats and advocates and communications experts around the world. And that was, I guess, 3 years ago now. And we already have our first countries who have endorsed the treaty. We're in negotiations and discussions with many countries around the world. We have 3,000 academics and scientists that have endorsed the idea, 101 Nobel laureates. 80 cities have already passed motions endorsing the concept and pushing their national governments to start to explore it. So it's an idea that's in process, but I think, at this moment in history, we need some pretty big, bold new ideas.
And do you feel the momentum?
It's huge. We started the treaty group during COVID, incubated it within Stand.earth because I knew enough about starting new organizations to know that I didn't have time to do it. And we wanted to create, a global directed network campaign. And so I went to Stand and asked Todd and the board if they would be willing to incubate this idea, which meant, you guys will do the HR, the admin, the organizational development, the finance, and be our fiscal sponsor. And we'll create a global governance steering committee and a global secretariat and staff and run just the content. And Stand agreed to do that, thank goodness. Today, so that was 3 years ago, and already we have close to 2,800, I think, NGOs that have endorsed the concept. Our website's been translated into 18 languages, not by us. I meet people every day who are campaigning on the fossil fuel treaty around the world that we didn't even know what they were doing. At COP27, I met a group of folks from South Korea. They were like, your TED Talk's huge in South Korea, and we've been campaigning on the fossil fuel treaty. I met a guy named Josh from Hawaii who came up to me and said, I got your first state. I convinced Hawaii to pass a motion endorsing the treaty. And I met people from Turkey who are working on the fossil fuel treaty. It really has become a global movement. With health leaders and faith leaders and youth leaders around the world calling for the fossil fuel treaty. And we've even had UN bodies endorse it. The World Health Organization has endorsed the call for the fossil fuel treaty. So it's building momentum. We now have 3 countries that have formally endorsed and are calling on the UN to start negotiating a treaty. And we're in conversations with at least 5 other countries. I think by COP28, we could have between 5 and 10 countries that are endorsing the call for the fossil fuel treaty and are creating bilateral and multilateral meetings to get other countries to join them. And if you look at the history of other treaties, as soon as you get that first core group, that starts to shift the social norm. And that's what we need, because we cannot solve climate change and protect the public good and people's lives and livelihoods as long as Trudeau is still approving more LNG projects and the Bay du Nord oil drilling off the East Coast, as long as Biden is approving Willow, the UK is approving new offshore drilling. You're not in a transition if you're still growing the problem. This is physics. We can't have our cake and eat it too. We have to stop expanding fossil fuels. And the science is really clear on that, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to the IEA, the International Energy Agency. They're all really clear that we can't afford new fossil fuel projects. And if we're going to keep the world below 2 degrees, get us back to where we could stay below 1.5 degrees, then in order to do that, we have to stop expanding the problem. And right now, all of these governments are saying that they're part of the climate solution, and they have climate leadership, and they're committing to implement the Paris Agreement, yet they're still expanding their fossil fuel industries. And that, is literally what's threatening us. We're going through a global heat wave right now where there are fires all over the planet. This is only going to get worse unless we slow down, we stop and manage a wind down. of the three products that we know are killing us: oil, gas, and coal. And I mean, the good news is we have solutions, and the solutions are cleaner and safer. I mean, what's a solar spill? It's just a sunny day. The fact is that the solutions that we have at hand now at scale, they're cleaner and they're safer and they're cheaper. So really all that's standing in our way is leadership and courage from our elected officials to stand up to the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, we had Dandelion Energy on, and they do heat exchanges, and they do heat pump energy, and everything, and ultimately all of this stuff is better for the consumer, and the consumers are happy, and the consumers are happy with the experience. They want energy, but they don't want all the other stuff that comes with it, but they also want it at a price that is affordable, and the new solutions are there. If you think about everything that you've done in the last 3 years, and what's happened in terms of just the momentum that you've been able to gain, like, where do you think you want to be in the next kind of 3 to 5 years with the treaty?
Well, within the next year, we need to kind of solidify this core group of countries, and we need to start putting meat on the bones. I mean, we don't have a draft treaty. We have principles of what a treaty needs to include, and that's on purpose. A lot of the diplomats and lawyers that we've been working with around the world have said, look, countries have to create the draft. They have to own it, or it will never see the light of day. And so what we've been doing is doing the research necessary to show why we need a treaty and what kind of things it needs to include. We've done a project of engaging people around the world in 5 different regions on what are the principles that should be under a treaty. For example, equity. Like, we need to have the principle of equity in who gets to produce and how much, and also how to support countries in moving away from fossil fuels. There are some countries like Ecuador who are drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon, not because they want to, not because they're going to use that oil, but because they have to feed their debt. They literally have a debt for oil swap with China. And so even if they understand, which I think the Ecuadorian government does, the climate implications, the biodiversity implications, the human rights implications of new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon, they can't stop. And so we've been identifying some of those barriers: debt and resources, the need for electrification, infrastructure that would fast track moving, the power of the fossil fuel industry, the public subsidies that are keeping the industry alive, even though solutions are cheaper, a lot of those things, and starting to look at what are the principles underneath the treaty. So within a couple of years, we're going to have a draft of the treaty. We're going to have a much larger group of countries, 20 to 30 countries, who are starting to discuss and negotiate a treaty. And we're going to have a recognition from elected officials, especially in the wealthy countries, that it's not okay to continue to expand the problem and produce more and more new fossil fuel projects. Because look, no one's saying turn off the taps overnight. It's unrealistic. We still use fossil fuels, but that doesn't mean we can't stop producing more projects, because the pipeline we build today, or the new LNG facility, or the new fracking facility, the new oil rig, that's not designed to produce today. It's infrastructure that's designed to produce 20 to 30 for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. Well, we all know that we need to get to net zero by 2050, which means we need to decline production and emissions fast. And so we think that the campaign, the initiative, the conversations between countries is going to start to shift that norm. So I don't expect in a couple of years you're going to have the US, for example, joining a treaty, or Canada, because they're huge producers. And in fact, Canada and the US have plans to produce more oil and gas, more expansion of oil and gas than all the other countries combined. It's about 75% of the expansion that is planned for the next 5 to 10 years is all in Canada and the US. But what gives me hope is looking at history. We know that the US, for example, and Russia never signed the nuclear non-proliferation treaty either, but they stopped stockpiling weapons because it became unacceptable. That social norms shifted. And so, that's part of the journey, the process that we're hoping to create. And I hope that the fossil fuel treaty campaign gets so big, gets so much support from millions of people, from opinion leaders, from celebrities, from cities, from states, that it becomes a household conversation, because that's what we need it to be.
We all hope, and we all will hopefully push and sign and do everything that we can that it does happen, because as you pointed out, and many people all over the world, we need it. We're getting very kind of close to the end of our time, and I just had a question. A lot of the kind of the branding of this podcast was inspired by the book The Lorax, which obviously is this kind of cautionary tale of, what happens when you use our resources and overuse our resources. But often people are just thinking and listening to this because they're, entrepreneurs, or maybe there's somebody that wants to get involved in climate and climate solutions in the sustainability space. Like, what would you say to those people that are kind of on the fence? What kind of motivation to that you say that, like, this, this is this the time? Is this, what should they do?
There is, and never has been, a better time to work on these issues. First of all, it's exciting. What we're actually doing and what we're actually seeing right now is a reinvention of the world. How we travel, how we operate, how we heat our homes. And it's happening right in front of our eyes. There was more investment in clean, renewable energy in the last year than there was in fossil fuels. We have tipped that balance. So getting involved now is exciting, but it's also essential. You can't hide from this, and it can seem overwhelming, but that's why it's important to get up every day and think about what your piece of it's going to be, to engage with it with whatever capacity that you have. That means doing the work to understand the issues, but it also means setting some clear objectives and goals for your company, for your family, to engage in the work. We all now, and this polls show, people feel a lot of anxiety about environmental degradation and climate anxiety because it's so big and it's so overwhelming. You can't, turn on the radio without hearing about another fire or another flood or etc. The best way to deal with that anxiety, the best way to create hope, is every day to set out your objectives and your goals and figure out what you're going to do and with whom, because you don't want to be alone in this stuff. And it's not just about your lifestyle. It's not just about saving up to buy your Tesla. It's about laws. It's about remembering that we're not just consumers, we're citizens. So write to your elected leader, write to your member of parliament, your MLA, call them up, because ultimately they work for you. And every time they hear from us, then they know that this is an issue that is critical for them to address. So really, I guess it's just engage in whatever way you can, and don't wait, because we all want to be able to look at our grandchildren in the future, at our family, and tell them that we did everything we can. And right now, every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere will save lives. So some people are saying, it's too late. We're already got too much carbon. We're going to hit 1.5. It's out of control. No, that despair and a refusal to act because you think it's too late, that's a privilege. Certainly a privilege that a lot of my colleagues in the South Pacific and other areas where they're experiencing the worst climate disaster, that's a privilege that they don't have. Every act we take right now can have an impact and will save lives. So don't wait. Start now.
Well, thank you. This has been, your story is incredibly inspirational, from, traveling to standing on top of a van to creating a fossil fuel treaty that is being adopted and supported by countries and more and more countries and diplomats. It's an incredible journey to see where you've come. And so thank you so much for joining us. Where can listeners find a little bit more about you or Stand.earth or the fossil fuel treaty?
A lot of exciting campaigns at Stand.earth. So join us. We're doing campaigns on the IT sector, on the shipping sector, on the fashion sector. Lots of information for all of you there, and great campaigns on old growth in Canada and the Amazon as well. And then at fossilfueltreaty.org. please sign up, join us, and make it your own.
Thanks again for joining us and telling your story. We are happy to support it and continue to make sure that we share the stories and all the campaigns and all the fight that you've been working on.
Thanks so much. Take care.
This podcast is co-produced with The Brand is Female. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Someone Like You. And if you did, please share this. We're a new podcast, and I would love it if you could share it with a family member, friend, colleague, work colleague. Share it on Slack, whoever you do. Just share and spread the message of these incredible brands. Please also support these type of companies. They're doing the hard thing, and the hard thing often takes a lot of people to get on board. And don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and review. I'm Marco Pimentel. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on Someone Like You, you can find us on Instagram at Someone Like You Podcast with all the links to the podcast, our website, and more information about the brands that we feature. Thank you again.